Alright, so hopefully you watched part 1 of the distributive property. If you haven't watched that one yet, please make sure and watch that first. Because in this video, what we're going to be learning about is how to undo the distributive property. And it's a form of factoring, is what we call this. But in order to understand the concept, you first need to understand the distributive property. So since we're focusing on factoring, one of the things that we need to be aware of is this term, greatest common factor. Now I know that you've done this in the past, but let's review what a greatest common factor is. The greatest common factor is the numbers. So well, first off, you need to understand what a factor is. But a factor is the numbers that multiply together that give you the original number. So it's the numbers that multiply to give you the original number. So for example, if we're dealing with 8 and 12, the factors of 8 and 12, well 8, we'd have 1 times 8 is 8. 2 times 4 is also 8. So the factors of 8 are 1, 2, 4, and 8. The factors of 12, well 1 times 12 is 12. 2 times 6 is 12, and 3 times 4 is 12. So the factors of 12 will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. So those are the factors. So the greatest common factor is going to look at these two sets of numbers and figure out which is the greatest factor that they have in common. And hopefully you see that that would be the number 4. So between 8 and 12, the greatest common factor would be 4. Now that's a very important concept to get in order to understand or be able to do this lesson. Now, some of you guys may have to start by listing out the factors just like we did here. Others of you, if you look at the division properties or if you look at your multiplication table, you can also look at the factors that way. But one way to tackle this is to look at your 8 and 12. Start with the smallest number, the 8. And think, okay, what is some numbers that go into 8 evenly? 8 obviously goes into 8, but 8 does not divide into 12 evenly, so we don't want to use 8. What's the next largest number that goes into 8? 4. 4 goes into 8. Oh, 4 also goes into 12. There we go. We just found our greatest common factor. So that's the way that I like to approach it, but if you struggle with that, you can list out the factors individually like we just did, and then find the greatest common factor that way. All right, so how does this work? Let's say if we have what's over on the right, 2a plus 2b, and I want to undo the distributive property. So here outside the parentheses, I would have 2, meaning I'm going to multiply 2 times something and get 2a plus b. Well, what would I multiply 2 by to get 2a? A. What would I multiply 2 by to get 2b? B. So inside of parentheses here we would have a plus b, because 2 times a would give you 2a and 2 times b would give you 2b. Here's another example, written a little differently. Let's say if we have 5a plus 5b. Now if you notice in that previous example, 2 was the greatest common factor between 2 and 2, because it's the largest number that goes into both of those. So let me ask you this, what's the greatest common factor between 5 and 5? 5! I love easy questions, don't you? All right, so 5 would be my greatest common factor, so we would put that outside of the parentheses. And then inside of the parentheses we'd think of, well, what would I multiply 5 by to get 5a? A. What would I multiply 5 by to get 5b? B. Feels like a Sesame Street video. But we would have inside the parentheses a plus b. So what we've just done is we undid the distributive property. So let's look at this next example. This next example we have 8x plus 12m. Not quite as simple as the last two. But if you took good notes, you would already have part of our answer, because what we have to start out with is what is the greatest common factor between 8 and 12. And if you have good notes, you'll be able to look back and see that it was 4. Or maybe you just have a good memory and you remember that the greatest common factor would be 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with that greatest common factor outside the parentheses. Now inside the parentheses, we're undoing the distributive property by dividing. Okay, because the distributive property, we would multiply all the numbers in the parentheses by whatever's outside of there. So if we're going to undo it, we're going to divide. Now what are we going to divide? We're going to take 8 divided by 4, which is 2, and 12 divided by 4, which is 3. And how is that going to look? Well, we would have 2x, and then we would have 3m. Now here's the beauty. I've said this before, but here's the lovely thing about math. You can always check your work and make sure that you have the correct answer. If I distribute the 4 through, I should get the same thing that I have originally. And sure enough, 4 times 2x is 8x, and 4 times 3m is 12m. So that's a quick, easy thing you can do to check to make sure that you have it correct. Let's look at another example. They're getting harder. 14 and 35. Now maybe you have to list out the factors of 14, which would be like 1 and 14, 2 and 7. And the factors of 35 would be 1 and 35, 5 and 7. And then hopefully you'd be able to notice that 7 would be the greatest common factor. Or maybe you got that on your own by thinking, well, 14 doesn't go into 35 evenly. What's another number that goes into 14? 7. 7 goes into 14. 7 also goes into 35. You always want to make sure that it's the largest number. So that greatest common factor in this case would be 7. And again, if we undo the distributive property, we would divide. So we would take 14 divided by 7 and get 2, and 35 divided by 7 would be 5. So we'd have 2b and 5d would be your answer. Sticking with me? Let's try another example. I want you guys to try this one on your own. So I want you guys to try figuring out what's your greatest common factor between 18 and 27. And write that down, just like we did the previous ones. And then undo the distributive property by dividing. So I want you guys to take a second, pause the video, and hit play when you're ready to check to see if you did the problem correctly. How did you do? Let's find out. So, did you get 9 times 2a plus 3c? 9 would be your greatest common factor. And 18 divided by 9 is 2, and 27 divided by 9 is 3, so we get 2a plus 3c. So there you have it. That is our last example. So hopefully between these two videos you understand how to use the distributive property and also how to undo the distributive property. So good luck now as you work on today's and this week's assignments.